A homeless girl burst into the ICU and stopped doctors from giving up on a billionaire's son. But no one was ready for what happened next. The time of death was 2:37 in the afternoon. Dr. Margaret Kline stood at the foot of the incubator and said it without hesitation, without ceremony. Time of death, 14:37. We've lost him. 3 seconds of silence. Victor Harrington stood against the far wall with both hands at his sides. 45 years old, $2 billion company, never broken in a boardroom. He stood there with his mouth slightly open and his eyes fixed on the incubator, not crying because his body had not yet received permission to acknowledge that what he'd just heard was real. His son was 9 months old. Nurse Patricia reached for the folded white cloth on the tray beside the incubator and shook it open. The ICU door blew open. The woman who came through it had nothing that belonged here. Mid-20s, black, soaked gray hoodie, sneakers held together with electrical tape, a canvas tote bag patched with safety pins. No badge, no clearance, nothing. She crossed the floor in 4 steps, snatched the cloth from Patricia's hands, and struck the baby's chest twice. Quick, precise, certain. He's not gone. This baby is not gone. For 1 full second, the room didn't know what to do with that. Then the monitor flickered. A single blip. Almost nothing. Almost. Get her out. Kline pointed at the door. Security! Now! 2 guards reached her from either side. She didn't fight them. She let them take her arms but kept her head turned back toward the incubator, still watching the monitor as they pulled her. You stopped too soon, she said, talking past the guards, past Kline, directly into the room. He still has reflexes the machines weren't reading. You do not touch Victor Harrington's son. Kline's voice dropped to something quieter than a shout, which was worse. She stepped around the incubator and looked at the young woman with the look she reserved for things that had entered the wrong room. You do not come near him. The name landed the way Kline intended, a clarification of stakes, a reminder of who was who, a sentence that placed the woman being dragged toward the door firmly on the wrong side of the order of things. The staff responded accordingly. Nurses stepped backward. 2 technicians leaned toward each other in the deniable sideways way of people communicating without wanting to be seen doing it. A guard shifted to the hold you use on something you want contained. Victor had not moved, still against the wall, hands at his sides. But his eyes had tracked from the incubator to the woman being pulled toward the door, and behind them something was running. Fast, urgent. The motion of a man handed a problem he didn't expect and cannot put down. He was still, she said from the doorway. The door shut. Monitors resumed their flat testimony. Kline set her clipboard on the supply tray and turned toward Victor with the expression of someone ready to guide him through what came next. From behind the closed door, faint, thin, pressing through the insulated glass like something that refused to accept the terms it had been given, a sound. Small, exhausted, unmistakably, impossibly alive. An infant beginning to cry. Victor's head turned. The hallway outside the ICU held 4 people. 2 security guards, the young woman between them, and Nurse Lena Park, who had come out of the supply room at the wrong moment with a stack of folded linens and was now standing completely still, watching. The young woman was not fighting. She had stopped pulling the moment the door closed. Not surrender, but the decision of someone who understood that struggling would give them the story they wanted. She stood in their grip with her back straight and her eyes on the narrow window in the ICU door, neck angled at the precise degree required to keep the incubator in her line of sight. She was shaking, not from fear, from hours of cold and wet and the kind of running on nothing that doesn't let you feel it until the motion stops. Her hands trembled at the ends of the guard's grip, and she closed one of them around the red thread bracelet on her wrist, gripping it the way you grip something you've carried past the point of deciding to. Her name was Nia Brooks. 24 years old. They stopped too soon. Controlled, but moving faster now, the speed of someone trying to transfer information before the window closes. And the color behind his left ear. Still pink, not gray. That means circulation. And there's movement in his abdomen, left side, shallow but present. The machines can miss that. They can read 0, and the body can still... "Lady," one of the guards. "Still be holding on." She stopped herself, her jaw set. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, pushing back something that kept rising. And in that 1 second, without her saying a word, what she'd just described settled into the hallway like a stone dropped into still water. She had learned to read those signs somewhere specific. Not in a hospital, in a living room, at a bedside 2 years ago. Her mother, Diane, in the final weeks of late-stage cancer, when the attending had said everything medicine allowed, and Nia had stayed anyway. Had sat there through the night, counting the intervals between each faint diaphragmatic contraction, the small, rose-tinted color that held longer than it should have behind the ear. The signs everyone else had stopped watching for. Her mother had taught her, without meaning to, that a body announces itself in the smallest ways to anyone paying close enough attention. She had carried that knowledge into this hospital when she was hired. She had carried it to a room 14 months ago where a man named Douglas was being left behind too quickly, and she had tried to say so. And she had been fired for it. She had been sleeping outside this building for 3 months. She had seen the transport van this morning, seen the man in the back seat holding his infant with the expression of someone refusing a prognosis, and she had followed them in. Nia opened her eyes. "No one deserves to die when there's still a chance," she said. "Not for the guards." It came out of her the way you breathe, without deciding to. She looked at the bracelet. Red thread, pale with age, a glass bead the color of river water, a knot her mother had tied 10 years ago. "Wear it until the knot comes loose on its own," her mother had said. "Knots tied with love don't break before they're ready." The knot was still holding. "The color behind his ear," she said, quieter. "1 contraction, left side, every 12 seconds. The body is still trying to hold him." She looked directly at Lena. "I know what I saw, and I think you do too." Lena did not answer, but she did not look away. Through the ICU door, thin and raw, and still going. An infant holding on. The baby's sound lasted 40 seconds. Inside the ICU, the readout had produced something in the past few minutes. Irregular, faint. The kind of signal that invited interpretation. And interpretation was already underway before the resident could speak. "Artifact," Kline said, pulling documentation forward without looking up. "Post-compression artifact. Documented as such. Time-stamped." Within 8 minutes of Nia being removed from the ICU, an internal message went out, flagged urgent, routed to all 4th-floor staff, security, and administration. It included a still image from the ICU camera. Nia, mid-strike, time-stamped 14:37. An unauthorized individual had breached patient care protocols and created a potential liability event. All staff were to treat it as an active security concern. Kline had sent it herself. The image circulated on phones throughout the floor. In a nursing staff group chat, someone used the word unhinged. The clip spread further than it was supposed to. In the private consultation room, Kline sat across from Victor and shifted to her warmer register. Not soft, but directed. The voice of someone who knows that in rooms like this, the first person to provide structure wins. What happened is not only a breach of protocol, it's a liability event. The board needs you to sign a confirmation that any intervention outside standard protocol and any consequences arising from it are the responsibility of the family, not the hospital's clinical team. Victor looked at the window. "My son cried," he said. "What the monitors recorded is consistent with Artifact. The sound you heard was physiologically consistent with post-compression residual air release." Kline held her position. Running additional tests will not change the results. What it will do is extend an extraordinarily painful period, raise questions about liability from the intrusion, and delay decisions that need to be made. The board has already sent you a message. A leak framed incorrectly at this stage could affect your company's value in ways we both understand. Victor said nothing. He looked at his hand and found something in it he hadn't consciously put there. It had happened in the corridor minutes earlier, while the guards walked Nia toward the stairwell exit. She was still talking. "He's not gone. They stopped the resuscitation too early. No one is listening." And as the guard shifted his grip, the red thread bracelet caught on his hand. The knot gave. The bead came loose and dropped to the floor. Neither guard stopped. Nia hadn't seen it fall. She had been looking at the ICU window. Victor had bent down and picked it up. He had also watched what happened in the corridor around her as the guards moved her through it. A nurse stepping sideways into a doorway to avoid the path. A staff member brushing her sleeve and checking his hand afterward. The way you check after touching something you've been warned about. Then looking away, satisfied. Others pulling back from the corridor's edges. The practiced, habitual quality of it. The complete absence of discomfort in the doing. He looked at the bead now. Blue-green, dirty, red thread fraying from the hole. He signed the document. He signed it because Kline's voice was measured and credentialed and present, and because the thing moving behind his eyes was not yet large enough to override what was right in front of him. He set the tablet down. He did not put the bead down. Outside, the guards walked Nia to the stairwell door. She paused, looked back down the corridor toward the ICU. "He's not gone," she said. Quiet. Not for anyone. Just maintaining the record. Then she went through the door. The rain had gotten worse while Nia was inside. She stood on the sidewalk outside the East Service entrance and let it hit her. Hoodie soaked through, taped sole peeling further back from the upper. She watched the fourth-floor windows, and she waited, because she had nowhere to go that mattered more than staying within range of this building. At 3:14, the quality of movement through the fourth-floor glass changed. The lateral urgency of staff responding to a status shift. Inside, Caleb was crashing again. The blood pressure irregularity had crossed from manageable to critical, and the team worked hard, and for a few minutes it appeared to be stabilizing. Then it wasn't. Kline moved immediately. She stood outside the ICU door and addressed the corridor cluster. Nurses, residents, staff, in a voice quiet and weighted, carrying enough authority to frame everything that followed. This is what happens when protocol is bypassed. The compression that baby was subjected to without authorization contributed to this instability. What occurred this afternoon was not heroism. It was reckless interference. And every person in this hallway needs to understand the difference. Staff stood watching. Someone filmed it on a phone, held low but recording. Someone else laughed. Short, low. The kind that happens when a room has decided what kind of thing something is. Comments passed between people in the corridor, quick and angled, about what kind of person does what Nia had done. Victor was brought back out of the consultation room when Caleb destabilized. He stood outside the ICU window and watched his son's numbers move in the wrong direction for the second time in one afternoon. Kline appeared at his elbow. "We are doing everything available. Every protocol. You have my word." A beat. "The authorization you signed was the correct decision. It protects Caleb's care from further interference." Victor's jaw tightened, just briefly. Then the stillness came back over him. He turned away from the window. He walked to the table where the document waited, and he signed the second confirmation, the one that said he understood, the one that turned his back on the woman outside. And he set the pen down and did not look up. Downstairs, Nia was already being walked to the exit. A security guard held her arm. Staff in the corridor watched as she was escorted out. No one spoke to her. One nurse turned away before she could make eye contact. The sliding doors opened, and the guard walked her through and out into the rain, and the doors closed behind her. And that was it. She stood on the wet sidewalk in the gray afternoon light. She was shaking again. She pressed one hand flat against her sternum, not crying, not collapsing, just trying to find the steadiness she'd started the day with, and she whispered it to herself, low and ashamed, and still, somehow, not quite finished believing it. I missed him. I was right there, and I missed him. But she didn't sit down, and her eyes, turned back toward the building, were not all the way empty. Not yet. Victor stood alone in the family waiting area and turned the bead over in his palm. He had been in enough rooms, high stakes, high pressure, every variable accelerating at once, to know the difference between a situation that was resolved and a situation wearing resolution as a disguise. He had built a company on that instinct. The board paid him for it. He thought about Nia's face. Not the hoodie, not the tape on her shoe. Her face when she was talking in the hallway. The flatness of it. The absence of the tells that come with performance. No pitch escalation. No eye movement checking whether it was landing. Just a person reporting what they observed. The color behind the ear. The 12-second intervals. The specificity of someone who had watched a body do those things before and had no reason to invent them now. He opened his hand and looked at the bead. Blue-green, dirty. The thread frayed from a knot that had held a long time before it gave. He was still looking at it when Lena Park came around the corner of the waiting area with the walk of someone who has made a decision and is moving before they can unmake it. She sat down across from him without being invited. I need to tell you something. Victor waited. At 14:34, I was watching the third lead readout on Caleb's monitor. The amplitude was inconsistent with a complete flatline. Within the range our equipment sometimes fails to classify correctly in infants when electrode placement is calibrated for adult weight. She paused. I flagged it at 14:36. Dr. Kline reviewed it. She documented it as artifact at 14:37. Victor was still. Time of death was called at 14:37, he said. Yes. The silence that followed held everything in it. There were signals, Lena said. Small ones. I couldn't fully explain them then. I still can't explain all of them now. She looked at him directly. But that woman could. The way she described the abdominal movement, the color, that kind of specific comes from having watched a body do that, not from guessing. Victor looked at the bead one more time. Then he stood up. Inside the ICU, Caleb's monitors were moving toward a second threshold. The team had reached the point in the protocol where discontinuing life-sustaining intervention was no longer theoretical. The resident was at the monitors, hands doing what they were trained to do, his mind running a calculation he hadn't been given permission to run out loud. Victor pushed through the ICU door. Stop, he said. Do not turn off those machines. Kline moved to intercept him, positioning herself between him and the incubator. Every medical option has been exhausted. What you are asking? I'm going to get the woman from outside, he said. He looked past Kline to the resident. Do not touch those machines until I come back. That is my decision as this child's father, and as the person responsible for this facility. Victor, Kline's voice sharpened. You are bringing an unstable, unauthorized individual into a critical care environment. That is grief making this decision, not you. You're not being asked to allow it, he said. You're being asked to stand still. He left. Stairs, 4 flights, fast, jacket open, and through the east exit into the rain. Nia looked up from the sidewalk. He crossed to her in 9 steps. Tell me everything, he said. All of it, right now. 1 second of measuring. Then she told him, 4 minutes straight, without stopping. Her mother and the nights of counting intervals when the attending had said there was nothing left to count. The sensation. She used that word precisely, knowing it wasn't clinical. Of knowing a body wasn't finished, because bodies that are finished stop presenting new information. And Caleb had been presenting new information until the moment they pulled her away. The color behind his left ear at 1435. The electrode placement problem for his weight. The diaphragmatic rhythm and what it meant. She did not perform any of it. She just said it. When she finished, Victor nodded once. "Come with me," he said. "They won't let me in." "I know. Come anyway." Kline was at the elevator bank when the doors opened. She had positioned herself there deliberately. Composed, tablet against her chest, staff gathered loosely behind her. Victor stepped off. Nia stepped off 2 steps behind him. Kline's composure held for the duration of a breath. Then something in her face closed. Every door shutting at once. "Victor, what you are doing?" "Lena." He looked past her to the nursing station. "I need the monitors recalibrated for his weight and age. Electrode placement corrected for pediatric proportion." Lena was already moving. This individual has no clinical credential. Kline stepped sideways, filling the path with the weight of 25 years of being the fixed point in rooms like this. "You are exposing yourself to a liability this hospital cannot absorb, and endangering your son a second time." "Move," Victor said. Quietly. Quietly enough that the staff behind Kline caught it in the silence that followed, and several took an involuntary step back. The instinctive recalibration of people who have just determined where the center of gravity is. Kline held her position 1 beat too long. The beat of someone who has never been the movable object encountering that experience for the first time. Then Victor stepped around her, and the authority she had been projecting shed from her like a thing that requires a fixed point to exist. The resident opened the ICU door from the inside. Nia set her bag down by the door, crossed the room, stood at the incubator's side, and was quiet for a moment. Not frozen, not afraid. The quiet of someone who knows what the next few minutes require and understands it cannot be performed, only brought. She placed both hands flat on Caleb's chest. Steady pressure, warm palms, not forcing anything, holding. She began to hum, low, barely audible over the monitors. It had the pattern of a lullaby without being precisely one. The melody of something sung to a child in a room that was gone by a woman who was gone, carried forward through years of grief and stubborn love by the only person who had memorized it without intending to. The monitor showed a flat line approaching its final threshold. 15 seconds. 20. The room was not breathing. At 31 seconds, the line moved. Small, irregular. Arguable still to someone determined to argue, but the resident didn't speak. Lena didn't speak. One of the nurses made a sound, barely, not a word. 44 seconds. The recalibrated readout, Lena's calibration, 17 pounds 6 ounces, electrode placement corrected, showed what the earlier readings had not been equipped to show. Faint, effortful, present. Caleb made a sound. It came out the way things come out from under great pressure. Small and raw and completely unambiguous. The sound of a system that has been working very hard for a very long time to get here. His fingers, loosely curled against his chest, opened slowly and closed around the side of Nia's index finger. The grip was light. It was the most substantial thing in the room. Victor made a sound he didn't appear to know he'd made. Nia kept humming. Her eyes stayed on Caleb's face. His eyes, clouded and unfocused, moving toward the sound of her voice. Not sharply, not all at once. The way any small thing moves toward warmth without yet knowing what warmth is, only that moving toward it is right. Behind them all, something else was happening. In the family waiting room down the hall, a mounted display had switched inputs. The ICU's internal camera was now broadcasting live to the waiting room screen. Not configured to do this, someone had redirected the signal, and the people in the waiting room were watching. What they saw: a young woman with both hands on a baby in a low-lit room, a line on a monitor moving in the unmistakable rhythm of a heart that had decided to remain. But the system had pulled not only the live feed, it had pulled the stored footage from the preceding 90 minutes. And in that stored footage, now visible on the large screen, was the sequence from 1436. Kline at the workstation, reviewing the monitoring alert Lena had flagged. Kline at the foot of the incubator, 30 seconds before calling time of death. And a gesture, brief, specific, directed at the nursing staff, that did not correspond to any continuation of resuscitation protocol. A signal to stand down. Not ambiguous. Visible to anyone watching. Visible to anyone who understood what it meant to stop a team before the window had formally closed. In the waiting room, someone started crying. Someone else was already on their phone. At 5:03 p.m., the resident documented the return of spontaneous cardiac activity. He entered it with the care of a person who understands this notation will be read many times and wants the record to be exact. Victor crossed the room, past everyone, past the resident and Lena and the nurses who had stopped pretending not to watch, until he was at the incubator's side, looking down at his son. Breathing, eyes open, holding Nia's finger as though the concept of release had not yet occurred to him. Victor held himself together for approximately 12 seconds. Then his hand went to his mouth and he bent forward and cried, fully, without pretense, the cry of a man who has been holding something too large for too long and whose body has finally refused. Nia did not step back. She stood where she was, one hand on the incubator, Caleb's grip on her finger, and said nothing. Because nothing was what the moment required. 2 minutes later, Victor straightened. He lifted Caleb from the incubator, carefully, with both hands, and carried him across the room to where Nia stood. Then Victor Harrington bent his knees. He crouched down, holding his son, in his wetsuit, in front of Nia and the entire assembled room and the camera feed still running to the waiting room down the hall, until he was below her eye level and looked up at her. "You were the only one in this building who saw that my son was still alive," he said. Wrecked voice, absolute clarity. "Just you." Nia nodded. "I need to say something in front of everyone in this room." He rose and turned to the assembled staff, the resident, Lena, the nurses, the technicians, Kline still in the doorway. "This woman was dragged out of this room while she was telling the truth. I signed a document an hour ago that I am withdrawing my consent from, effective right now. And Dr. Margaret Kline is no longer serving in any clinical or administrative role at Harrington Memorial, effective this moment." Kline drew herself up. "You cannot." "I own this building," Victor said. Quiet, not performed. "And you've known all afternoon that I could." He looked at her directly. "You reviewed a monitoring flag at 1436 and documented it as artifact at 1437. You signaled the team to stand down before the resuscitation window had fully closed. The camera recorded it. The waiting room just watched it. The room was silent. Kline's face, composed through everything the afternoon had put it through, did not break. The work of it simply stopped, the way a machine stops when the power is cut. And what was left underneath was just a woman standing in a doorway with nowhere left to go. She did not say, 'I followed protocol.' Not here, not now. That sentence still had distance to travel, through formal proceedings and depositions and the grinding machinery of institutional accountability, and it would be received there the way it deserved. In the waiting room down the hall, someone started recording the screen. Around the 4th floor, in the cluster of staff who had gathered and filmed and whispered and stepped back and wiped their hands and said what they'd said about Nia all afternoon, a shift was happening. Not all at once, not cleanly, but present in the quality of the silence, in the particular stillness of a crowd that has been on the wrong side of something and has just understood that it was. Caleb Harrington opened his eyes a little wider. He was still holding Nia's finger. The formal investigation opened the following Thursday. Not a departmental review, not an internal audit where an institution evaluates itself and arrives at conclusions it finds tolerable. Victor had specified, in a communication to the board sent at 9 the previous evening, that the scope would cover the events of the afternoon in full and additionally encompass the termination of Nia Brooks 14 months prior. The board had not argued. By 10 that evening, the clip had been seen by enough of the right people that the board understood their position precisely. They issued a joint statement acknowledging that the afternoon's events required thorough examination and that the institution was fully committed to cooperating. The kind of statement institutions issue when they are out of other options. By the end of the first week, 3 things had been established from documentation alone. The first, the third lead amplitude irregularity. Lena had flagged that 1436 had been manually overridden in the system log at 1437, not auto-resolved, not reviewed and dismissed, but actively overridden using a physician-level credential. The credential matched Dr. Kline's login. The second, the timeline between Caleb's admission and the death pronouncement was 6 minutes shorter than the resuscitation protocol for his presenting condition required. 6 minutes. Not visible to a family member without the protocol documentation, but there, exact and on the record. The third, the contamination protocol violations cited in Nia's termination paperwork had been created in the hospital's policy documentation 3 weeks after her termination date and backdated in the system. The person who backdated it hadn't known that the original file retained a creation timestamp separate from the modification timestamp. Dr. Kline, presented with the first finding, said she had followed established protocol. Presented with the second, she said the timing variation was within acceptable clinical judgment. Presented with the third, she was quiet for approximately 15 seconds and then asked for her attorney. Lena gave her statement on the 4th day. 3rd floor, her own request. She was precise and unhurried, and when the board's counsel asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, she thought before she answered. When you're not certain what you're seeing, and the person who is certain is your department chief, it's very easy to decide the problem is your uncertainty, not theirs. She folded her hands on the table. That woman outside the ICU had no uncertainty. She just had no standing. I've been thinking about the difference between those two things since Wednesday. The board's counsel wrote something in his notes. Consequences arrived in stages. Kline's clinical privileges were suspended. Her administrative roles dissolved immediately. The hospital issued its carefully drafted statement, acknowledging that aspects of care protocol on Wednesday afternoon had not met the institution's standards. Victor managed the consequences personally, met with every senior medical staff member, attended investigation sessions as an observer, said very little, paid attention to everything. On the day Kline received her formal termination notice, Victor was in the building. He hadn't planned a confrontation. He was there because he'd been there every day that week. Kline came off the elevator at 10 in the morning with her attorney and the box of personal items, turned into the 4th floor corridor, and found Victor standing in the hallway outside the east stairwell, near the supply room, near the bench, under the fluorescent light that had been humming all through that Wednesday afternoon. The exact corridor where Nia had been held by 2 guards and had told her truth to no one willing to hear it. No speech, no summation. Just a silence carrying the weight of everything that had happened in this building over the past week and over the past 14 months. And within it, Kline's face did the thing it had been preventing itself from doing for days. Not a breaking, a surrender of effort. The face of someone who has maintained a single position for a very long time and has finally run out of the energy it requires. She walked past him. She did not say, "I followed protocol." That sentence had run out of the context it required. Later that afternoon, Victor and Nia sat in the fourth-floor family room. Caleb was sleeping next door, improving steadily, and the building held the quiet of a late afternoon when the urgent part of the day has passed. "Tell me about before," Victor said. "All of it." She told him about Douglas, the full account in order. The Tuesday admission, the Wednesday afternoon, the sense that the decision being made was moving faster than the situation warranted, her 3 attempts to say so, the disciplinary meeting, the termination, Douglas's discharge 2 days later with a shelter referral and no follow-up, the readmission 3 weeks after that, the end of it. She told him about her mother. The 2 nights counting intervals, 12 seconds, 14, back to 12, while the attending said there was nothing left to count. What she had learned in that apartment: that the body announces itself in small ways to anyone willing to pay attention, and that paying attention is not always welcome, and that choosing not to pay attention when you are able to is a choice with consequences that live in you. "After my mother died, I thought for a long time I had failed her," she said. "I read the signs correctly. I tried to say so. It wasn't enough." She looked at her hands. And then Douglas. Still not enough. By Wednesday, I didn't know if anything I knew how to do actually mattered, or if I was just someone who noticed things that were going to happen anyway. She stopped. "But I couldn't walk away from the window," she said. "Even then, I don't know what that makes me." Victor looked at her for a long moment. "I know what it makes you," he said. The following week, Nia received a letter on hospital letterhead, a newly created position, Patient Advocacy and Care Oversight Coordinator, full-time, benefited, with a formal mandate to conduct independent reviews of care decisions for any patient who requested one, with particular attention to patients who were uninsured, unhoused, or otherwise without institutional advocates. The salary made her read the number twice and fold the letter and sit with it before she could look at it again. Victor's team had arranged transitional housing 4 blocks from the hospital. Lena dropped off the badge and key card with a handwritten note. "For what it's worth, I won't need to sit in a supply closet next time." 11 days after the investigation opened, Nia came back through the front entrance. Temporary badge on a lanyard, canvas tote over her shoulder, different from the old one, unpatched, bought at the thrift store on Meridian. When the elevator opened on 4, Lena looked up from the nursing station and smiled the way she had been careful not to smile all week, fully, without reservation. "Welcome back," Lena said. "Thank you for staying," Nia said. She meant the whole week. She meant Wednesday. She meant the supply closet. They walked the floor together, Nia and Victor. She asked precise questions and pushed back twice on points she thought were framed incorrectly. He agreed with one and defended the other. She accepted it provisionally and said she'd want to revisit in 90 days. "That's exactly what you're here to do," he said. Halfway down the corridor, they passed the bench by the east stairwell. Nia slowed. She looked at it. Gray padded seat, chipped armrest on the left side, the fluorescent light above still humming its one frequency. The light under which she had sat in her wet hoodie with the bracelet taped together and her sneaker held on with electrical tape, and the full weight of the world confirming, as it had many times before, that she was not the kind of person whose knowledge was worth hearing. "I want to put something here," she said. "A marker. Something that tells any patient in this building, not just the ones with resources, that if they believe something is wrong with their care, there is a specific place to come and a specific person to tell. And that person will listen." Victor looked at the bench. "Yes," he said. They kept walking. 4 months is not very long. Not long enough for an institution to fully become what it has decided to become, or for a person to fully become what they have decided to be. Nia understood this. She had spent most of her life watching institutions move at the pace of people with no pressing reason to hurry, and she had been the pressing reason more often than she had been anything else. But 4 months was enough time for some things. The patient advocacy position was staffed and its protocols defined. 8 cases reviewed under the new independent oversight process. 3 resulted in care adjustments. 1 initiated a formal review of a physician's documentation practices. 1 resulted in a patient, uninsured, admitted through the emergency entrance on a Wednesday night with no family present, a woman named Geraldine, 61, who reminded Nia of her mother in no specific way and every general way. Receiving a follow-up appointment she had not been offered and a specialist referral she had not known to request. That last case had been Nia's personally. 40 minutes of discharge paperwork, line by line, asking questions with the directness of someone who treats no as a door, not a wall. Geraldine got the referral. She also gave Nia a hard candy from her coat pocket and said, "You look too thin," which was the most motherly thing anyone had said to Nia in 2 years. And Nia laughed. The involuntary kind, full and uncontrolled, for the first time in longer than she could place. She had driven home that evening and sat in the parking lot outside her building for 11 minutes without getting out of the car. Not because anything was wrong, but because she needed a moment to hold what had happened without moving. She had done that. The referral, the paperwork, the 40 minutes. And it had mattered. It had actually mattered in the specific, concrete way she had always believed things could matter if the right person was in the right place, paying the right kind of attention. She was the right person. She was in the right place. That was new. After 11 minutes, she got out of the car and went upstairs and stood in her kitchen for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. And then she made tea, and it tasted like something. The apartment was on Meridian Street, 3rd floor, 1 bedroom, a window that caught the morning light from the east, a kitchen with counter space and a stove with 4 working burners, and a refrigerator that hummed when it ran. She had stood in front of that refrigerator for a long time on the first morning, just stood there, door open, looking at it. Not at anything specific, but at the general fact of it. The eggs on the second shelf, the half-gallon of milk she had bought 2 days ago and hadn't finished yet, the leftovers in a container with a lid that actually sealed. Small things that other people didn't notice because other people had never had a reason to notice them. She had closed the refrigerator door and stood with her back against it and let herself feel what that was. The fullness of it, the sheer ordinary abundance of it, until it stopped feeling too large to hold. It had taken a few weeks. On a Saturday in early spring, the evening was coming in soft through the kitchen window. Victor was in the living room with Caleb, 10 months old now, who had recently discovered that objects continue to exist when he can't see them, which Victor was finding extraordinary with the attentiveness of someone who has learned the cost of not looking. Nia could hear them from the kitchen. Caleb making the self-satisfied sounds of a baby who has just confirmed, for the 14th time today, that the toy he dropped on the other side of the blanket is still there when he lifts the edge. Victor's voice saying something low and warm in response. Not words she could make out, just the tone, the particular frequency of a man talking to a small person he is still a little astonished to have. She stood at the cabinet and listened to it for a moment before reaching in. Her hand moved, from habit, the long accumulated habit of 3 months sleeping in places that didn't belong to her, toward the pocket of the old gray hoodie hanging on the chair by the door. She kept it not because she needed it, but because letting it go had not yet felt like the right thing to do. And she had learned, in the past 4 months, not to force the timing of things like that. Her hand knew that pocket. Inside, her fingers found what they expected. A piece of dried bread, hard and small, that she had been keeping there so long the keeping had stopped being conscious. She pulled it out. She looked at it. It was not romantic, what it had been. It had been hunger management. The particular calculus of someone who never knew when the next meal was coming, and so made the current one last as long as possible, carrying what couldn't be eaten now for later, for the moment when the need was sharper than the dignity of pulling a piece of stale bread out of a coat pocket in a public place. She had done that. She had done it many times. She was not ashamed of it, but she stood in her kitchen on Meridian Street with that piece of bread in her hand and the refrigerator full behind her, and the evening light on the counter, and the sound of Caleb laughing at his toy in the next room. And she understood, quietly, without ceremony, that she didn't need to carry it anymore. She set it on the counter, with the finality of a decision that has already been made. The way you put something down when you are done carrying it, not because it was heavy, but because what it represented has changed. She stood there for a moment, with her hand still resting next to it, not quite ready to step away, the way you stay near something after you've said goodbye to it, just to make sure the goodbye took. It took. She took out the oats. Her mother's porridge. The recipe from the mornings after something hard, when warmth was the only medicine available and was therefore worth making slowly and well. Rolled oats, brown sugar, cinnamon, a pinch of salt, milk added at the end so it didn't scorch. Her mother had made it with the radio on low and the kitchen light warm against the dark outside, and a particular unhurriedness that said, "This morning is worth taking care of." Nia had stood in that kitchen as a child and watched her do it, not knowing she was memorizing it, not knowing there would come a day when the memory of how her mother stood at a stove would be one of the most load-bearing things she owned. She made it at her mother's pace, without rushing, because the making was also for her. Victor appeared in the doorway with Caleb on his hip. Caleb had been crying 5 minutes ago. Not distress, just the inexplicable crying of a baby who has decided he requires a different situation than the one he is currently in. And Victor had handled it with the specific, slightly bewildered competence of a man who has been learning, month by month, that parenting a 10-month-old is mostly the practice of being surprised and not letting it show. He was better at it than he'd expected to be. Nia had watched him become better at it, and it was one of the quiet things she carried from that Wednesday afternoon. That the man who had stood against the ICU wall with his face broken open by grief had been capable, underneath the breaking, of becoming someone his son could count on. Caleb extended both arms toward Nia with the directness of a baby who has decided exactly where he wants to be. She turned from the stove and took him and settled him against her shoulder. He put his open hand flat against her cheek and patted it twice, the claiming gesture of someone who has found something he considers his, and she stood there for a moment, very still, feeling the specific warm weight of him, and the porridge warm on the stove, and the evening light coming in from the east, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something works out. Not in the dramatic sense, not the ICU, not the moment the monitor moved. That was one kind of working out, fast and enormous and witnessed by everyone in the room. This was the other kind, the slow kind. The kind that builds in small increments over 4 months of getting up in the morning and going to a job that matters, and coming home to a kitchen with food in it, and making dinner, and hearing a baby laugh in the next room. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but accumulates, until one Saturday evening you are standing at a stove with a wooden spoon in one hand and 10 months of stubborn, miraculous life against your shoulder, and you realize you are not waiting for the other shoe to drop. She looked up, not at the ceiling, at whatever the space above it reached toward, whatever people look toward when the words they need to say are not for anyone in the room. "Mom," she said quietly, "this time I didn't leave anyone behind." She had said versions of this before, to a hospital ceiling after Douglas, to the open sky from a shelter fire escape, on a wet bench under a humming fluorescent light with her bracelet taped together and her sneaker held on with electrical tape, and the knowledge, ground into her by years of evidence, that the world was not going to thank her for what she knew. She said it now differently, the way a sentence arrives at the place it was always going. Not as a hope, not as a vow she was trying to keep. As a fact, quiet and warm and entirely hers. Caleb made a sound against her shoulder that was not a word, but communicated everything. From the living room, Victor said something about whether the porridge needed more cinnamon, in the tone of a man who clearly does not know his lane but is very comfortable in it anyway. And Nia said, "No, it does not." And he said, "Just checking." And she shook her head and turned back to the stove. The ordinary texture of it. The unspectacular, irreplaceable texture of an ordinary evening with people you trust in a place that is yours. She had not always known what that felt like. She knew now. She intended to remember. Outside on Meridian Street, the city was doing what it does on Saturday evenings in early spring, settling toward quieter without going all the way. Car sounds, and a dog somewhere, and music through someone's open window 2 buildings over. The low, persistent music of ordinary life in ordinary time. The bracelet on Nia's wrist was new. Made herself on a Tuesday evening, with red thread from the craft store 3 blocks away and a single bead, pale blue-green, river-colored, from a shop that sold them in small paper envelopes. She had tied the knot the way her mother had tied it, with care and intention, firm enough to hold and no tighter, because knots that last are not the ones pulled to breaking. She hadn't told anyone she'd made it. It was the kind of thing that didn't need saying. She served the porridge. They sat at the kitchen table, Nia and Victor and Caleb, who had his own bowl in theory and both hands in the porridge in practice. And the evening came gold through the east window with the quality of early spring light that hasn't learned to be warm yet, but is trying its best. And the city moved through its Saturday outside. The bracelet knot held. It was always going to.